Executive overthrow and executive immunity. A view from Naivete.
I'd like to briefly explore the relation between two recent cases from SCOTUS, each of which attempt to radically alter the Constitution of the U.S. from the bench. The Chevron Deference and the presidential immunity cases. In each of these, the same fundamental issues were in question: to what degree ought the courts interfere with, intervene on, or interpret the meaning and use of presidential powers. In the former, the ruling was in every conceivable way: the courts ought interfere with, intervene on, and interpret the meaning and use of presidential powers to ensure that they align with whatsoever interpretation of the law the court has. In the latter, the ruling was, if we can trust the dissenters in the case here, the president can literally murder their rivals and the courts shall have no say whatsoever in the matter, provided that it is within their core duties, presumed to have no say if it is within their official duties. From a naive view, fundamentally these rulings are in direct contradiction to each other. Anything could follow from a contradiction. That's just basic logic. In the former, the presumption of official stature for the executive branch is removed, meaning that rather than presume that the executive branch has authority to do its job as it sees fit, the courts have shifted the presumption of innocence to that of guilt, e.g. the executive branch is presumed to be guilty of incompetence in the performance of its actions, subject to the court's whims and desires of interpretations at every turn. In the latter, the presumption of official stature is that the executive branch has absolute presumed innocence in even the most egregiously unlawful actions imaginable. The audacity of the courts to presume to judge an obviously guilty president with its own eyes. These naively fundamentally contradictory opinions being penned by the same justices, back to back. Meaning they performed judicial gymnastics in their minds to hold rather blatantly contradictory positions, again, at least from a naive position. To draw out this contradiction just a bit from the folds of naivete, the executive overthrow case involved the courts intervening on presidential core and/or official duties. To be clear here, the administration of the government and the execution of the laws being core and/or official duties of the president. In that instance, somehow, these justices have spilt ink saying that they have every right to interfere with the president's duties, be they core, official or unofficial principal duties. In the executive immunity case, those same core duties are to be immune from judicial review. The president, and we might presume, the executive branch beneath them, being presumed to have as much leeway as is possible sans any review by the court, up to and including rather obvious criminal actions. Now, the main difference between these cases is that in the former we are speaking of the normal duties of the president and the executive branch. In the latter we are speaking of obvious criminal acts that may just so happen to occur in the course of the normal duties of the president and the executive branch. There may be a lot of legal mumbo-jumbo used to try and parse out those different meanings, but at its core that is the actual difference. This court spilled its ink to say that they have every right to interfere with any and all normal operations of the U.S. government, and that they also have no right to do so when it comes to outright abhorrent behavior of the U.S. government. In terms of doing its job, the executive branch must operate under the yoke of 9 justices and their minions. But in terms of committing murder, overthrowing the government, interfering with democracy, nah, they free to do that. Unfortunately, there is little recourse but degrees of drastic measures. Defying SCOTUS's unlawful orders seems to be in the criminal protected class of actions the executive branch can do. This would be the least drastic measure. SCOTUS having rendered itself incompetent, we ought give them the 25th, a sweet retirement of fools. Smile and nod along, and ignore their blithering foolishness. If someone attempts to take the executive branch to court for doing its job, simply ignore them. If a ruling is made by the court that they are not doing what the courts think they should, ask them to enforce their rulings themselves. And continue to do what the executive branch is supposed to do. This tactic has been used before in American history, and indeed, historically in many places around the world all the way up to the current. In such instances the executive branch may or may not bother arguing the cases. I'd recommend not bothering to argue such cases anymore, and simply act as it sees fit. which is the way the executive branch has been run since the beginning of America. Doing this would greatly weaken SCOTUS. Not doing this would strengthen SCOTUS and hence be a terrible thing to do. The executive branch can act more drastically, using its newfound powers of unlimited criminal activity without judicial review to act extrajudicially as they see fit towards the removal of traitorous justices and the installment of new justices that are loyal to, well, does it matter to whom or what they are loyal to at this point? SCOTUS having the opinion of unlimited criminal activity being allowed after all. Folks may think this is hyperbolic, it is not. I'd even go so far as to say that such sounds like the most effective and efficient method in the short term. We could act with more drastic measures, which I sadly think are needed at this point, and aim for a constitutional convention to update the Constitution, clear off some of the old baggage it has, and wipe the slate clean on the ship of fools' rulings. Anything less would be uncivilized.
Consequentialism.
The reality of a stymied legislative and executive branch by SCOTUS's rulings is civil war. Here I am not particularly making any threat or hyperbolic statement of note. I am pointing out a rather straightforward fact about politics. If you stymie the capacity of people's freedom of political expression, if you in other words mute their capacity to make law, regulations, and so forth by transferring said power to the courts, you will inevitably end up in a civil war. It may take time, and who knows exactly what would set it off, but it would happen. As noted in the Limits of Executive Authority piece, link in the description, in regards to the Chevron Deference case itself, the prime example of that case is exactly an instance whereby folks could reasonably determine that civil war is the only real recourse left. Namely, that original Chevron case was used as a means to stymie the will of the people via their legislators to do a particular thing relating to the environment in particular. And the overturning of it was done for the exact same reason, to block environmental regulations. The point being that if there is no political means of actualizing environmental regulations, folks interested in doing such things have no other recourse but to civil war. Again, I am not necessarily arguing that we ought to over that issue. I am pointing out the raw political reality and the utter foolishness of SCOTUS. By turning themselves into a ship of fools, with their power-grabbing maneuverings, they've set up an inevitability of civil war around one issue or another. If that example isn't clear, somehow, pretend for a moment that you care about some law being passed and enforced. You and literally a majority of the populace go through great efforts to get it passed, elect officials with mandates to get it done, and they delegate the getting it done to their underlings. Alas, there is an asshat, just one, a single person somewhere in the US that doesn't like it. Why? Does it even really matter? So, they take it to court, and since the executive branch's authority is presumed guilty of incompetence, that one single asshat overturns the will of everyone else. Obviously they would be a rich asshat, as the rich asshats have the cash to run the courts as they see fit. Since there is no real political means of getting it done, whatever it may be, what would you do if you actually really cared about the issue? Hence, the imperative of doing one of the preceding relatively far less drastic measures to counter the ignoring of SCOTUS's rulings as the executive branch sees fit, informing SCOTUS that they can feel free to enforce their unlawful rulings at a time of their choosing. The wholesale dissolution of SCOTUS in a thoroughly criminal manner, in line with SCOTUS's opinion that the president can do any sort of criminal thing they so desire, and installing a new SCOTUS with an imperative to overturn its predecessors' poorer judgments. Or a constitutional convention, whereby the Constitution itself is updated, thus vacating SCOTUS's rulings on a whole host of issues, and dealing with a host of other problems and foibles in the current. Hence, and again, anything less would be uncivilized, for, full of scare quotes here imho the alternative to these is civil war as an inevitable outcome of the ship of fools spilled.